So James Malazita is an assistant professor of science and technology studies, game and simulation arts and sciences at Rensselaer Polytechnic in Troy, New York. He's the founder and director of Rensselaer's Tactical Humanities Lab and studies the politics and epistemologies of game engines and software and how they co-produce ways of knowing and interpreting the world. So take it away, please.
Great, thanks so much. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Great. So my talk today is drawn from a book manuscript that I'm currently putting together that is what I call a critical platform studies reading of the Unreal Engine. And so my talk today is the subject of light raced, PBR or physically based rendering, and racial mattering. So just as an intro for some of the work I'm going to be doing today, critical platform studies contributes to literatures in platform studies, which is a subset of game studies, that analyzes how software and hardware contribute to creative constraints and affordances of digital media. But it also pulls from feminist science studies and post-colonial science studies in leveraging the rhetoric of co-production. So co-production is going to be the big technical word I'm going to use today from STS. And co-production is essentially a way of understanding materiality and knowledge that says rather than imagining the material world and the cultural world as two separate things that intersect and interact with one another, that rather the material and cultural worlds are co-produced together. So for example, in this talk, I'll be talking about how race, light, and rationality are not these separate, distinct cultural elements that kind of feed into one another, but rather that our understandings of things like photorealism and race are actually deeply bound together and change one another as time goes on. And so the way I'm going to argue that is through an analysis of the use and design of Unreal's physically based rendering system, and talking about how ways of seeing, particularly how reality, photoreality, and stylization are co-produced, right? So what counts as real or photoreal is not just an empirical observation of the world, but is itself is situated in political practice. And the title of my talk plays off of Luce Irigarei's really famous feminist science studies article, Is the Subject of Science Sexed?, where Irigaray argues that not only do we need to talk about things like gender in terms of representation, so like why aren't there more women or non-cis scientists, but also gender in terms of epistemology. So for example, her famous example is the equation for the speed of light itself a gendered equation? And I'm not going to get into that too much now, but this idea that gender goes beyond what we imagine as bodies and representation. And finally, I'm going to argue that physically based rendering techniques and practices contribute to what Amanda Williams calls color theory and racial mattering, or what the matter and materialization of race looks like. Before we get started though, part of the major idea behind this book is that there is no such thing as under the hood. And what I mean by that is that while we might be talking about, while we're used to talking about game engines or software as these technical objects that underpin game development, from a feminist science studies perspective, what counts as above or underneath or surface or depth has more to do with the person analyzing or oriented to the object than it does a universal ontological statement, right? So me, priorly trained as a game designer, there's nothing under the hood about the game engine. It's very clearly an above ground surface level cultural artifact, where speaking as a white person, race is very much under the hood for me, right? And I have to do extra work to see how racial matterings occur. So the idea of peeling back layers of game development is actually more about the who does the peeling. But before I get started on that, I want to talk quickly about the moon landing. So in 2018, NVIDIA, heavy scare quotes, proved the moon landing. They did this by using the Unreal Engine and recreating the set of the moon landing, the July 20th, 1969 moon landing. They did this by using real-time ray tracing via physically based rendering in their Turing GPU architecture used for the newest generation of NVIDIA NTX cards. So NVIDIA had two arguments here. The first argument was, one, please buy NVIDIA cards. The second, more important argument was that through the use of real-time ray tracing, as well as physically based rendering, we can actually prove that the moon landing happened and therefore debunk conspiracy theories by setting up a physically accurate model of what the moon landing was like, measuring how light interacts on the surface of the moon, and therefore say that all these artifacts that conspiracy theorists call out about the moon landing actually should naturally occur, would naturally occur on the moon. So I bring this up for a couple reasons. One, just an introduction to what physically based rendering is. So one, physically based rendering is more technique than software. So the same rendering engine can use physically based or non-physically based or mixes of both. And even though my book focuses on Unreal, it's also a technique that's used beyond just the Unreal Engine. But importantly, the physically based rendering, while it does look really, really good, and I'm going to show some neat examples of physically based rendering, it's based upon a truth claim that we're not measuring how light, quote, actually works, but how it's supposed to work. This is from an interview I did with an Unreal developer. So this idea that physically based rendering, rather than needing to create what we think of as traditional shader models of different algorithms applied to different materials when you want different types of impacts, so different types of reflectivity, specularity, constant shading. Rather, we can produce a universal shading model that by manipulating certain attributes, every single material in the scene can be universally applied to different lighting conditions and look realistic or look the way we want it to look. Physically based rendering is not a new technique, even though we're seeing it a lot more now in real-time rendering, but rather is a technique that was developed kind of at the same time as raster-based rendering and the Fin and Blin shader engines, but now kind of computational power and different techniques have caught up, where now physically based rendering is viable in real-time rendering. So physically based rendering assumes a universality of light and surface, right? So this idea that the way that light works is all objects have certain surface properties. Light interacts with these surface properties by bouncing off them. It picks up its specularity, its roughness, and its color based upon the color temperature of the light, as well as based upon the surface dimensionality of the object itself. And importantly, especially for issues of rape, we can understand how things like skin or translucency or subsurface scattering work by also measuring how light is absorbed, refracted, or bounced around at the surface and the depth level. And so on the one hand, this sounds really, really great, right? And in a lot of ways, it is great. It allows us to create really photorealistic looking real-time renderings really quickly without needing to change our shaders and materials between scenes depending on the lighting environment. But interestingly, it's also being rhetorically used as a way of getting closer to the truth of what light is. So it's not uncommon, for example, to see different spectroscopy websites giving particular RGB values and specular values and metallic values for different materials. One, just as a nice community sharing exercise, but also more importantly, as a way of trying to ontologically demonstrate what is the most accurate way of producing something like wood or tree bark or gold. You can also produce really interesting types of, this is Unreal's material editor, really interesting types of things in physically based rendering through connecting these different types of nodes. But at the end of the day, the twin goals of physically based rendering are affective. So how does it emotionally look? How does it visually look? And empirical, right? There's some idea that physically based rendering is more real than traditionally based computational rendering. This becomes an issue when we start thinking about things like rendering skin. So Theodore Kim, a professor at Yale, just had a really, really great Twitter thread and some papers that talk about subsurface scattering and skin as a tour of whiteness. Right, so that computational models for how to render things like skin assume white skin as the default, including the importance of transparency, translucency, subsurface scattering. There's also been great work by folks like Evan Narcisse who talk about hair rendering engines, so that the vast majority of computational work has assumed white hair and not coiled or black hair or Afro-Indigenous hair. And there's also been really interesting work by folks like Amanda Phillips and Tanner Higgin, who have analyzed how bodies and character creators are used within engines and kind of the racialized logics that are embedded in here. So there's an example that Amanda Phillips uses about Fallout 3. But while all this stuff is really great, I also want to talk today about how race enacts itself in these rendering engines outside of just skin color. And particularly, I want to talk about race as environment or race as materiality. So often when you see demonstrations of physically based rendering, so all of these are PBR renderings, they tend to be kind of have like a brownish gray air to them. They tend to have a lot of intersections of light and shadow. They tend to have a lot of white characters. They also tend to have this idea of like grit, right? That what demonstrates something is either squeaky cleanness, like this marble background, or grit. And there's a lot of work being done that I don't have time to go into today about the idea of the conflation of whiteness with grit, as opposed to blackness with the ghetto, as opposed to Latino or colonialization with the favela, right? So that grit intersects with race in different ways. But what's interesting about these spaces, the way that they're coloring, the way they're shading, assumes a universality of space, right? That the way that we're rendering things always should look the same. This is actually really different from how we traditionally use color theory, which is color theory and lighting is not just about getting quote unquote photorealistic shading, but also about communicating mood and affect and emotion. And so here's an example of using color theory, including complementary color shading to create quote unquote natural light. You actually can't really use complementary color shading in physically based rendering. That's not really how light works. And yet that's a classic technique that's been used throughout all of art history and also in games like Fortnite, which I'll return to in a second. Most importantly, this type of rendering and lighting is also really important, not only for classical art historians and artworks like Impressionism, but also for lighting and shading characters of color, right? So the idea that the way that we create realistic and affectual dimensions of color is not just about representing how light actually works, but by thinking about the different intersections of skin on top of darker skin and different types of light. And we've seen these types of controversies about delegitimizing or de-emphasizing the way these types of lights work. For example, in the most recent Vogue cover of Simone Biles, right? So there was a big controversy around Annie Leibovitz's photography that essentially flattened out Simone's skin tone and color. But more than that, it wasn't just about how light works. The image on the right-hand side is from Instagram user Who Invented Charisma, titled "If a Black Photo Editor Did Simone Biles' Vogue Cover." Right? So it's not just about how light is captured through the photo lens, but also about the entire assemblage of how we treat the interactions of light, color, and emotion within the types of photo editing work that we do. And so interestingly, Fortnite does not use PBR-based rendering, and it allows for the creation of events like this. So this is Travis Scott's astronomical video, that concert that appeared live from the 23rd to the 25th of April 2020. You'll notice that the types of lighting and coloring that are used amplifies kind of an ephemeral otherworldly quality. It amplifies types of lights that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see, quote, in the real world. And these types of, similar to, as we've seen, the Simone Biles re-edit, as well as Nyla Magruder's work around how to light characters, we see kind of different color palettes emerging from these different traditions of lighting, rendering, and aesthetics than we do from what we're seeing emerging as a tradition of physically based rendering. However, what's also important to note is that physically real colors have not been totally captured by physically based rendering techniques. So this is an example of Amanda Williams, who's an art theorist and an architect. She develops a concept called colored theory that talks about colors like ultra sheen blue, pink oil, Harold's Chicken Shack red, Currency Exchange yellow, Newport Squares teal. These types of colorizations and color palettes that you see in racialized areas, that you see in places that are being erased from gentrified areas, as also being real colors that tend to not enter into what means to take a photorealistic color. So in conclusion, what I'm working with towards in this book is not an argument that PBR is somehow internally racist, and you actually can do some types of stylized effects in PBR, but rather what I'm arguing is that our idea of what counts as photoreal, as what counts as real imagery or stylized imagery, has as much to do with the types of world and color that you experience, which of course has to deal with issues of race, class, and power, as it does any objective measurement of light. And therefore treating physically based rendering as a universal empirical measurement of light also becomes entangled with ideas of whiteness that relate whiteness to objectivity, universality, and rationality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was super interesting. In fact, that panel was just like incredible. Do we have any questions from the floor, or because Twitch is usually a little bit behind? Just before we get into that, though, we're going to go straight into the next conversation between Colleen and Phoenix, and then we'll have a short break before the final panel, just because we're running a bit behind. So any questions? I might just ask a quick one, which is there's been some kind of work in the history of photography about the way that darker skin tones weren't used to calibrate those cameras and stuff. Do you see those kind of like parallels being kind of like recapitulated in the game engines kind of space, or is there something a bit more complicated going on, do you think?
Sure. I mean, the reason I like using, as you pick up on, like photo reality, right, is when things like game engines are reproducing imagery, they're trying to reproduce the types of imagery that we're used to seeing on screen, which is obviously filtered and mediated through a lens, right? And so what you're talking about with things like the Kodak color palette and calibration cards, right, which largely featured white skin, as well as like really kind of racist arguments that like, well, the reason it's not a social reason why white skin photographs better, it's about the chemicals. But of course, that's also about the chemicals that we chose to use to take pictures of certain types of skin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, what I find more interesting is not just about types of skin tone, but what types of overall color palettes become associated with different racialized and class identity positions, right? So this idea that in order to represent something like blackness or indigeneity or colonialized perspectives in games is beyond just representing things like characters, but also representing the racialized colored materiality or materiality of color that we see within their worlds.
Awesome, thank you. Anything from Twitch?
Yeah, there's sort of a more general question about the overall industry and how like realism is treated in the industry. Basically asking, is there like a lot of people making bold claims about like, hey, like video games should look like this art style, or is it just sort of is in the AAA world, I guess, a steady climb towards more and more realistic graphics, sheerly for the sake of, you know, sort of a Jurassic Park, like they can do it, so they just do it? Or is there more sort of, I guess, discussion about like what video games should look like?
Yeah, so there's, from what I've seen, very little normative discussion. So the assumption tends to be that photorealistic work is the most important thing and everything else can build off of that, right? Which is kind of true. If you have more accurate photorealistic lighting models, you can do interesting things with quote unquote stylized lighting models. But what's also interesting is like at places like SIGGRAPH, you get this work where I had a colleague tell me a story once where it's like, okay, here's a presentation on 50 pages of math to get like the texture and color of ketchup correct. And everyone's like, oh yeah, great. And the last slide is like, also here's what ketchup looks like when it's applied to a dinosaur, right? And so like there's this interesting back and forth between what it means to like practice photorealism, but then also playing with, in non-photorealistic ways, those same types of systems, right? And so often, as the last presenter was talking about, these types of tech demos are also embedded in kind of like capitalist structures, right? Where Unreal is not just doing this to show off how cool their engine is, they're doing it to show off, hey, please buy and use and enter into our licensing agreements, right? And so all this stuff is mangled together where the major should is you should use my engine or our algorithms to achieve whatever effects you're trying to create.
Cool. There's another question here on Twitch that I'll relay. How can we integrate critical studies into research and discourse at the AAA level? both in academia and more importantly, outside of academia? How can we get the engine programmers to take these issues seriously?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research on this. I'll do a quick pitch. So Rensselaer Polytechnic just started our critical game design PhD program this year, which is explicitly about blending critical theory and technical practice. So if any of y'all are interested in getting a grad degree in games and critical theory, come here. But also more importantly, and I've done some of this work with computer science students, the idea of imagining what are the boundaries of the identity that create a computer science student or a computational practitioner or a designer, right? So what needs to change, first of all, is the idea that my major practice, the most important thing to learn is technical. And then also, it would also be nice if I'm like a good person and learn about race and learn about these different other elements. Right? As opposed to this idea that as a designer, as a technical practitioner working in the human world, a core part of my technical competency is also learning about and thinking deeply about social issues, issues of race, class, and power. So for me, it's not just about like, make sure people take a critical studies class or like throw books at the AAA industry, although I'd like to do that sometimes too, but also about changing our epistemic constructions of what it means to be a designer in the first place.